Hello, everyone. If you are here to see J Street's webinar today on aid to Israel, you are in the right place. We're just going to wait for half a minute to a minute or so and allow folks to join in. So we'll be getting started shortly. Okay, folks, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So I am happy to welcome all of you here today to this webinar. My name is Debra Shushan, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs at J Street. And I'm here to welcome you to a really timely discussion on U.S. aid to Israel, particularly amidst the threat of annexation. So let me just say a few words of introduction to the topic, and then I will introduce our panelists that we have joining us today. So a few words about aid. On a bipartisan basis, the United States has long, for decades now, displayed a strong commitment to Israel's security. The most concrete manifestation of that commitment has been the robust security assistance that the United States provides to Israel every year. The most recent agreement between the US and Israel on aid was signed in September 2016 through a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, that covers fiscal years 2019 through 2028 for $3.8 billion per year over that 10 years in military aid. As the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has laid the groundwork for unilateral annexation of the West Bank, a spirited debate fostered by J Street has emerged over the question of whether Israel should be able to use taxpayer dollars to facilitate annexation. The profile of this issue was raised considerably by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland when he recently introduced an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act that would have prevented US military assistance from being used to annex the West Bank. So we are here today to discuss this timely topic of US aid to Israel in the potential era of annexation with two experts, and I will introduce both of them. First, we have with us Andrew Miller. He is the Deputy Director for Policy at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED, and he spent about 10 years working on the Middle East in the US government. From 2014 through 2017, Andrew served as the Director for Egypt and Israel military issues on the National Security Council. He was responsible for coordinating US policy toward those countries. While he was at the NSC, Andrew was deeply involved in the Obama administration's efforts to modernize US military assistance to Egypt. Regarding Israel, he participated as a member of the US delegation that negotiated that 10-year MOU on security assistance to Israel. Andrew has also worked at the Department of State in a variety of policy and analytical roles related to the Middle East, serving in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and at the US embassies in Doha and in Cairo. We are also really pleased and privileged to have with us today Rob Malley. Rob is the president and CEO of the International Crisis Group. And prior to rejoining the crisis group, Robert served in the Obama administration himself as the special assistant to the president, as the senior advisor to the president for the counter-ISIL campaign, and as the White House coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and Gulf region. He also served as special assistant to President Clinton for Arab-Israeli affairs and director of the Near East and South Asian affairs at the National Security Council. Before Rob joined the Obama administration, he was program director for Middle East and North Africa at the Crisis Group, leading the organization's research, analysis, policy prescription, and advocacy in and about the region. His articles have been widely published in a variety of high-profile media outlets. And we are really privileged to have these two experts join us here for this webinar today. Andrew and Rob, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Okay, so before we get started with the webinar, I just want to tell or remind everyone who's joining us today that an important part of our webinar will be your audience questions. So when you have questions, please go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, click on that, and let me know what your question is. I assume that we're gonna have a lot of questions today during this webinar, and I will do my best to get to as many of them as I possibly can. So as we get started, I'm gonna ask our two panelists to share some words with us. And Andrew, we're gonna start with you.
Well, thanks very much, Deborah. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and always wonderful to join and work with J Street. Also great to be with Rob, my former boss, and someone whose work I've admired since I was an undergraduate on Israeli-Palestinian and other Middle East issues. So it's a really fantastic panel of speakers. I'm going to briefly discuss the MOU, which Debra mentioned, the $38 billion MOU on military aid, which the Obama administration concluded with Israel in September of 2016. It is billed as the largest military aid package in US history. It replaced a previous MOU that was valued at $30 billion, the prior one. And it covers the years 2019 through 2028. So while we concluded the MOU in 2016, its provisions did not become active until fiscal year 2019, the prior fiscal year, in that delay as the last MOU was being carried out. Beyond the sheer size of this MOU, which is enormous, $3.8 billion per year, I believe that comes out to about $10.4 million per day in US taxpayer money going to Israel. And as many of you probably already know, Israel receives more aid than any other country on the face of the earth. The only countries that even come close are Egypt at $1.3 billion and Jordan a combined $1.5, $1.6 billion. So I want to identify the 4 features of the 2016 MOU that I think are particularly important and that set it apart from prior MOUs. The first feature is the approach by which we negotiated it. Prior MOUs were largely done as purely political signals, and how they worked is that the 2 delegations essentially chose a number that sounded good for political reasons on both sides and then worked back from there. But President Obama, when he agreed to open these negotiations with Israel, said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it the right way, which is bottom up. We're going to begin by trying to understand Israel's threat environment. And then based on that threat environment, we're going to try to figure out what capabilities Israel actually needs to meet the threats that it is facing. And finally, once we understood the capabilities that would be required, we needed to figure out what type of equipment would be needed to ensure Israel had those capabilities. And the number was thereby determined by the types of equipment that Israel would need. So it was a very different approach in that regard, and it resulted in a fairly long negotiation. We really began in earnest in December of 2015, and we didn't conclude until September of 2016. The past MOU exercises were relatively shorter because there wasn't the same amount of spade work. It was largely a political exercise. This was a much more serious political security exercise that tried to address Israel's actual threat environment. The second unique part is that the $3.8 billion figure per year is not exclusively foreign military financing, which is the primary bilateral security aid account that is operated by the State Department. The $3.8 billion figure actually includes $3.3 billion in that FMF category, and for the first time, $500 million per year in missile defense funding. And that missile defense funding actually comes out of the Department of Defense's budget. It's completely unrelated to the FMF funding that has been included in past MOUs. Now, Israel received funding from the Department of Defense for many years. It just wasn't part of prior MOUs. The reason we decided to include it was that each year the amount Israel was receiving from this account was increasing. And importantly, unlike FMF, which is exclusively an aid account, the missile defense funding for Israel was taken out of the central missile defense account for the United States, from the Missile Defense Agency. That meant every dollar we were giving to Israel out of that account was one less dollar that was actually available to DoD for US missile defense. And while there are benefits involved in cooperation that many people know about, as missile threats to the United States were growing with North Korea, with Iran, with China, there was a concern that if we didn't establish a ceiling, that we may actually end up providing Israel aid to the detriment of the US's own military defense protection. So an agreement was made to include both of those. And it's also good for Israel because they don't have to go to the Hill every year and hope that Congress agrees to provide the aid. They know that it can expect approximately $500 million per year over the 10-year lifespan of the agreement. So it provides predictability, regularity, and it helps for budgetary planning. The third key feature is that we agreed with Israel to phase out a special type of foreign military financing, which is called offshore procurement. It's known by the acronym OSP. And this was a feature that is unique to Israel. Most US FMF aid is to be used exclusively on US defense equipment and services. So the idea is that while we're providing this aid to other countries, it's going to come back into the US economy because the recipients are spending money in the US. But Israel, under the last MOU, was allowed to use 26.3% of the total FMF figure it was receiving, which amounts to roughly $815 million domestically on its own products and services. And this was first provided to Israel in the 1980s. And the reason behind it was we wanted Israel to help develop its own domestic defense industry. Because it's a small country, it didn't necessarily have the right economy of scale to produce major items. And we wanted Israel to be more self-sufficient. And Israel wanted to be self-sufficient. So we originally allowed Israel to use the money in that fashion. Well, if you fast forward to 2016, that program was a complete success because Israel is now one of the top 10 arms exporters in the world. So from the US vantage point, OSP had succeeded in helping Israel develop a very robust domestic defense industry, and it was actually competing with US defense contractors in international markets. So while we wanted to continue providing Israel with the support they needed, we felt that they could spend more of the money that we were giving them back in the United States. So we eventually agreed that over this 10-year period, ending in 2028, that money would be zeroed out. The fourth unique feature is that the MOU was not explicitly tied to the peace process, unlike prior MOUs. And I want to be careful here because this could be misunderstood. This is not to say that the peace process was irrelevant to the MOU. At the time, we just felt it would be disingenuous to imply that this commitment of aid was going to result in imminent negotiations or just final status discussions that could reasonably deliver a two-state solution. So we did not include that language in the MOU. But nowhere in the MOU does it say that we're committed to provide Israel with this level of funding, irrespective of what happens in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. And certainly, while we were negotiating this, we were concerned about Israeli settlement building. We were concerned about the growing challenges of achieving a two-state solution, but we weren't foreseeing an annexation scenario where, with U.S. support, Israel might potentially exert its sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. So the MOU is essentially silent on peace process issues. So those are the four key elements of the MOU that set it apart. And it goes beyond just the amount, but you can see that it's not just the dollar figure, it's the various provisions regarding how assistance is provided. Before I turn things over, I thought it would be useful just to go over some of the things that Israel buys with U.S. assistance. And this is obviously relevant to the Van Hollen Amendment, which is designed to prevent the Israelis from using U.S. provided equipment and services to further annexation. The reality is that most of the equipment that Israel purchases with US taxpayer money is probably not going to be used to advance annexation. You know, F-15s, F-35s, refueling tankers, various equipment designed to transport troops. Most of that is probably not going to be what's critical to a response to annexation. There are two exceptions, though. One, Israel does buy Caterpillar bulldozers from the United States with US taxpayer money. And we know that type of equipment has been used in the past to demolish Palestinian buildings. And certainly as part of an annexation plan, it's certainly conceivable that Israel could use those bulldozers in order to eliminate obstacles or even to build new infrastructure designed to support Israel's control over the territory. So that's one item that very well could be used in an annexation scenario. The other thing that I want to note is I referred to OSP, the offshore procurement money that is used in Israel to purchase equipment. Now, the problem with this is we actually don't know what Israel uses that money for. When we were negotiating the MOU, we discovered that Israel took that money, that US money, and deposited it in the same account as the Israeli Ministry of Defense's national funds. And as we know, funding is fungible, there's no way to differentiate that money. So while we can determine with some degree of accuracy, whether a given US provided tank or bulldozer may have been used to support annexation, because we don't know how this OSP part of the funding is being spent, we have no idea whether American taxpayer money would actually be used to advance or to affect annexation. So that is very much an obstacle to any measures designed to ensure that US taxpayer money is not supporting the annexation enterprise until we have greater fidelity about how Israel uses that money, until Israel starts putting that money in a separate account, which we can use forensic auditing to oversee. There's just no way. And essentially the answer right now is, does Israel use that money in ways we wouldn't like? It's yes and no. It's a bit like Schrodinger's cat, because we don't know how that money is being used. We don't know how it manifests itself. So it's a very complicated enterprise. And that's one of the challenges of US-Israel defense spending, is that our relationship in this area is so unique. And Israel has benefited from so many privileges that other countries don't enjoy, that it can be difficult to use the same tools. So the way I see it, many of the members of Congress who are seeking to exercise greater oversight, who are seeking to monitor how this money is spending, they're trying to normalize the US-Israeli defense relationship to make it more similar to how we operate with anyone else. As I said before, no other country receives OSP. No other country receives missile defense funding directly from the Department of Defense. So it's these unique provisions that some interpret as a sign of our commitment to Israel, but also are unusual elements that can make it easier for Israel to do things that we wouldn't necessarily support for policy reasons. So I think with that, I'm going to stop there and turn things over to you, Debra and Rob.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. That was incredibly helpful. Obviously, your very detailed insider knowledge of the MOU is extremely helpful to this conversation. And I think that very last point you made about lawmakers now beginning to think about normalizing that US-Israel aid relationship in a way that makes it more comparable to other aid relationships that the United States has is a really important one. So now I would love to turn it over to Rob Malley. And Rob, very interested in hearing your thoughts on the US aid relationship at this particular moment.
Well, thank you. Thanks to J Street, an organization with which we worked very closely, obviously, during the Obama years and beyond. And thanks to you, Debra and Andrew. I think you've all seen why I will say, can't think of a better colleague, and it was really great working with him and remaining in close touch now. I want to start by trying to understand, why are we having this discussion now? And obviously we need to think of what moment we're in, and I'd argue we're at an inflection point when it comes to Israel-Palestine and by extension, the U.S. relationship to Israel and to the question of Israel-Palestine. If I had to summarize it, I'd say that we're at the point of exhaustion, perhaps post-exhaustion, with a process that has failed and a process that has ultimately served over many years now to perpetuate the status quo rather than to challenge it. And you could see that questioning as a result of this inflection point in all three places that are critical to this discussion. First, on the Palestinian side, I have, in the past few years, not met a single Palestinian, I'm going to say under the age of 40, but it may be under the age of 50, who still believes in negotiations, in the US mediating role, in the possibility of a two-state solution in the foreseeable future, believes in the PA. And therefore, on the Palestinian side, you're seeing what I would call an accelerated disenchantment. Then there's the Israeli side, and of course, both of you have alluded to it already. Didn't take the announcement of, or the Trump plan and the possibility of unilateral annexation by Israel for there to be a real questioning about whether this Israeli government and its predecessor were committed to a genuine, viable, sustainable two-state solution. But clearly, the fact that so many members of the government don't believe in a two-state solution, and that we're now talking very seriously about the possibility of unilateral annexation, that too has marked an inflection point and accelerated this questioning of the ways of the past. And then, of course, there's the Trump administration. I mentioned the Trump plan and the various decisions that the Trump administration has made that are ever more clearly tilting towards the Israeli side. And all of that has had, that in particular, but the other factors I've mentioned, have led to an accelerated change in the political landscape in the US, particularly among millennials, but also among many groups that are focused, whether they're millennial or not, on issues of rights. The Black Lives Matter movement in recent months in particular, and particularly among Democrats. So there's been a questioning of the traditional US approach towards Israel-Palestine, towards the Palestinians, among a larger swath of American young public opinion, particularly among minority groups and particularly among Democrats. And I think it's that marriage of the evolution in Israeli policy, in the Trump administration, and in parts of US public opinion that brings us to this questioning of the old ways of doing things and to this conversation. So my second point is that what that has sparked has been a broader debate about a whole host of issues. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the piece that Peter Barnhart wrote about one state, two states, or other solutions. So the questioning of the traditional paradigm, of the traditional two-state paradigm, questioning of the Oslo process, questioning of the US role, and of course, the issue of conditionality, which is what brings us together today, and which I want to focus most of my comments about. But it is part of, I think, one can't divorce it from these broader trends, broader dynamics, and broader conversation, which is taking place in the US, in particular among the constituencies that I mentioned. So about conditionality. The debate about conditionality is one that's accelerated over this recent period, particularly over the issue of annexation. Though I'd argue that in many respects it was a debate that was waiting to happen. Many would say that it's a debate that was should have happened a long time ago, and that the talk of annexation and the possibility, very real possibility of unilateral annexation, has given it more impetus, has accelerated, has brought it to the fore, and has opened up a possibility of conversation that was more taboo in the past. So that's just a few points I would make about the broad issue of conditionality. The first point is that it is not unprecedented in the history of US diplomacy to tie the provision of certain forms of assistance to Israel to its policies, and to at least issue a threat of withholding certain forms of assistance. That goes back to at least the Eisenhower administration. The Reagan administration and Carter administration. I think most administrations, or several administrations, at one point or another, the Bush administration with the issue of loan guarantees, have tied a certain form of assistance to a certain form of Israeli behavior, whether Israel was going to withdraw from the Sinai, whether it was going to remain in Lebanon, whether it was going to use cluster munitions in Lebanon. So that's not unprecedented. What is particularly unique about this moment is, number one, that was then and this is now, and there's been a long period where we have not seen that kind of conditionality exercised by the Clinton administration, by the Bush administration, by the Obama administration. We have not seen that kind of approach. And second, this is the first time, at least that I could think of, where the issue is tying the supply of military assistance to Israeli behavior towards the Palestinians. Towards other issues, we've seen it even towards, the sale of the provision of Falcons by Israel to China. There's been a host of issues over which we were prepared. The U.S. was prepared to say we threatened to withhold certain forms of assistance, but not to my knowledge when it came to behavior towards the Palestinians. You could argue the loan guarantees, although that was not really the withholding of assistance, but again, we could have a discussion about that. Nor has there been a case that I think of where Israel proceeded nonetheless, and the U.S. was faced with the decision of withholding a form of assistance, which the debate today could very well present. So the proposals that we're hearing today run the gamut. Andrew mentioned the Van Hollen amendment. There's a McCollum bill that I know you're familiar with. There's it's not a bill, but there's the AOC letter that that Senator Sanders and several House members have signed. A whole host of ideas that are out there about how, in the case of Van Hollen and in particular, how to try to deter Israel from annexing, or if it annexes, have it pay some kind of price. And in the case of the AOC letter, related not just to annexation, but to broader issues of Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. So these proposals run the gamut. Some have more teeth than others. I think Andrew just explained why Van Hollen would be very hard to implement because of the fungibility of resources. It would be very hard to know whether Israel was actually spending any of the money that the US is providing in aid on annexation. Some issues would be easier than others, but it would be, some would have more teeth. What AOC and her colleagues are proposing clearly would have more teeth than Van Hollen. Some are more realistic than others, some are more implementable. But I make one point, even though you could critique any one of these and speak about why they're not realistic or why they wouldn't really affect Israel's behavior. But the point I make is merely having this conversation, particularly now after many years where, as I said, we haven't seen sort of a forceful effort by the US to try to deter Israeli behavior by threatening withholding forms of assistance. Merely speaking about conditionality, merely putting the issue of military assistance on the table is groundbreaking. I mean, it breaks a seal. It opens up a conversation that very few people, certainly in officialdom, were prepared to have. So in that sense, whether one agrees with the legislation, whether one thinks that the legislation will actually have an impact or not, it's crossing a Rubicon, and which is why so many are nervous about it and so many others are excited about it. I think we are at, as I say, an inflection point, even in the debate in the United States. So it brings me to the next question. Should we cross that Rubicon? Should we actually support some of these legislative proposals or others? Because there's no single proposal out there, there can be no single answer. But let's at least take the sort of debate the issue of, generally speaking, should the United States impose any conditionality on military assistance to Israel? Political conditionality related to its treatment of Palestinians. As Andrew said, there's other forms of conditions, under the MOU, they can't spend a certain amount. They can't, over time, they won't be able to spend money on fuel. So there are conditions, but I'm talking about conditions related to Israel's behavior towards the Palestinians. So what are the arguments against? And there are strong arguments against going down that path. One is that the relationship with Israel is a special relationship. It's unique because of the history, because of the coincidence of interests, coincidence of values, at least of some values. That's one of the things that's been brought into question these days, of course. And therefore it needs to be protected and immunized, compartmentalized from Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, also because the US derives strong benefits from its security partnership with Israel. That's a fair point, although I think even most proponents of that argument would have to concede that there's some steps that Israel would take that would make it very difficult for the US to continue to provide military assistance. The question is where you draw that line. Some people would say if tomorrow Israel were to unilaterally annex 30% of the West Bank, as the Trump plan makes at least possible, I think it would become harder for some of the staunchest defenders of Israel, people who truly believe in a strong security relationship with Israel, to say that we could continue as is the level of security assistance. And there are things that are worse than 30% annexation. Again, I'm not saying that any of these would be realistic, but at least it puts in play the question of it is very difficult to argue that nothing Israel will do in terms of its treatment of Palestinians should have any impact on the provision of military assistance. Again, the question is, what's the trigger? Another question that people raise, one of the objections is, of course, that reducing military assistance, withholding military assistance to Israel would harm Israeli security, and that is something that for which there has been historically, traditionally strong bipartisan opposition to anything that would threaten Israel's security, given the environment in which it lives. Now, there are ways to mitigate against that. Phil Gordon and I wrote a piece not long ago in which we argued, we were just sort of saying, here's some of the steps that an administration might want to consider to try to deter Israel and then to have Israel bear the consequences of unilateral annexation if it chooses to go ahead despite the warning. And it would just simply to say, you tell Israel that you will deduct from the military assistance any funds that it spends on annexation from any pot of money. And if Israel, despite that warning, makes the decision that it's going to proceed with annexation anyway, then it has made the decision that its security interests can withstand that drop in military assistance by the US. So, that's a calculation that Israel will have to make. The US is not imposing it on Israel. It's simply telling Israel, you have to decide what's more important to you, annexation or the security assistance that the US is providing. Other ideas that I've heard some experts talk about is having a provision under which you would withhold assistance. Congress would mandate a withholding of assistance to Israel if it spends money or if it continues the behavior, and then you would define the behavior towards the Palestinians, whether it's home demolition, settlement expansion, or annexation, and say that the Secretary of State or the President could waive that withholding, but would have to issue a certification explaining what the behavior that Israel had engaged in and why it was deemed in the national interest to waive that withholding. That would have no consequence on the amount of money that the US would give to Israel, but at a minimum, it would force the US administration to be clear and candid about what behavior Israel was engaged in. And it would, again, it may not be the most effective means, but at least it would, without affecting Israeli security, shine a light on behavior that the US finds objectionable. Again, the other argument is that this would violate the MOU. As Andrew has said, that the MOU is not legally binding. And again, there's some, the US could reach the conclusion that some forms of Israeli behavior are inconsistent with the levels of military assistance that the US is providing. And then the final argument is that, you could threaten to withhold military assistance to Israel, but it's not really going to affect Israel's behavior. If it wants to do something that it believes is fundamental to its own interest, it will do it no matter the monetary or security impact from the US. And then they point to, correctly, a host of precedents where the US has tried to use the provision of military assistance, some of which Andrew was deeply involved in, Egypt, but also Bahrain, where there has been no impact. And that brings me to my final, but in some ways the most important point, which is the question of impact. I spoke of the fact at the beginning that we are at an inflection point, and many of us in the Obama administration, when we were talking about what our policies towards Israel-Palestine should be, and I'd hasten to add that we failed in trying to achieve progress, and we could have a whole session on that about why we failed and what we did wrong. But one question that we kept coming back to was this, the sort of the dilemma that we face, or the paradox or the failure that we face, which is, on the one hand, we would keep saying that the situation was unsustainable, that Israel was pursuing policies that were at odds with what we considered its interests if it wanted to continue as a democratic Jewish state. Of course, we had our criticism, strong criticism of the Palestinians as well. But when it came to Israel, we would say this was bad for Israel. And then we wouldn't do anything to make them bear the consequence of its perpetuation of the status quo, which made at least me always think that the irrational thing for an Israeli leadership to do would be to change a behavior for which it wasn't paying a price. And so if the incentive structure was such that Israel would continue doing what it was doing despite US objections, the US would object but would continue to provide the same level of political, diplomatic, military support as in the past, again, it would take sort of an irrational decision on Israel's part to change policies when its policies were not harming it. And that's the challenge. The challenge is not, how do we become tougher towards Israel? What should we single Israel out? It really is from a US perspective, from a US administration perspective. If the US wants to play an effective role in steering the parties towards what it considers to be a fair and just and viable resolution, if it wants to do that, is it prepared to exert the leadership and put the pressure that it needs on both parties to get to that end? It may conclude that it's not worth it, that the kind of pressure that it would have to exert on Israel is not something that it wants to do, and that's fine. That's fine. That's a decision that a U.S. administration could make. I have my own view about that. But what you can't do is, on the one hand, say we believe this is a priority, we want to push it, and then not do anything that is realistically going to get to that goal, because you can't really reconcile a policy that claims to care with a policy that chooses to close its eyes, that says we're going to be engaged in this policy, but if the parties don't, Palestinians or Israelis, don't do any of the things that we think they need to do, they will bear no consequence. And so that broadens the question beyond the issue of military assistance. I think it's, as I said, I think it's an important question to put on the table. I think it's a good thing that we're now at least having the conversation. But there are other forms of consequence, whether it is the vote that the US will take in international institutions, whether it's whatever the US says publicly, whether there's a whole gamut of the relationship with Israel has a whole host of dimensions, and you could affect one or many of those dimensions to express displeasure. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. It's not just military assistance, although, as I say, the question of military assistance is important that it's on the table. I don't think it should be taboo. I think it's a healthy thing that it's now being discussed. Where it will be resolved and when it will be resolved is another matter. And my final point is that this is a question that I think goes beyond the issue of annexation. And it shouldn't solely be pegged to whether or not Israel chooses to annex unilaterally Palestinian territory. Because, first of all, many Palestinians would say that they're already living in a reality of de facto annexation, even if it's not de jure. But beyond that, annexation or no annexation, we have been moving steadily away from a two-state solution for some time. And so any debate or questioning about the role that the US should play should occur regardless of whether Israel annexes. And I would hope that if Israel decides, and I hope that they decide not to annex, that they won't be simply a sigh of relief and say, now we can go back to business as usual. The question of annexation makes the issue of what US will do in terms of conditionality or pressure points, it makes it sharper and makes it harder to avoid. But the absence of annexation doesn't make it any less relevant to answer or any less relevant to a future administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Those were really great comments for thought here. And so as we proceed, I'm going to do something that is unusual that I usually don't do in our webinars, but I'm going to take the prerogative not only to be the moderator, but also to offer some of my own comments. And I'm actually going to respond to a question in the chat that comes from Gerald Sirota, who asks if I could clarify J Street's position on conditionality in general, and specifically on Van Hollen's proposal. So thank you very much, Gerald, for that question. I am going to take just a few moments here to talk through where J Street is on these issues. So J Street believes that US security assistance is critical in maintaining Israel's security against serious external threats. And we believe that this security assistance also helps to advance US national interests. J Street has advocated for robust security assistance packages, and that included the Memorandum of Understanding under the Obama administration, which J Street lobbied in support of to authorize and appropriate all of that aid that was pledged. And J Street believes that Israel should continue to receive from the US the full amount of security assistance outlined in the MOU, specifically the $3.8 billion per year for the duration of the agreement. Now, that being said, at the same time, J Street believes that US security aid must be used for the purposes for which it was intended, namely to address Israel's genuine defense interests, not to help implement or sustain illegal unilateral actions which undermine Israel's security, which trample on Palestinian rights, and which also contravene long-standing US interests and values. So specifically, American taxpayers must not foot the bill for unilateral annexation of the West Bank. Annexation crosses a major red line of international law. We heard Rob make the very important point there that de facto or creeping annexation is something that has been going on for decades now, and it is an issue about which J Street has and will continue to raise an alarm. The occupation in and of itself, even without annexation, absolutely is not okay, and it must end. With that said, annexation, de jure annexation, goes against decades of bipartisan US policy, and it's something that many of Israel's retired security establishment has made clear, that annexation and efforts to perpetuate a permanent occupation, to make that occupation permanent, are harmful to Israel's genuine interests, exacerbating conflict and instability. And so we believe that annexation must be met by meaningful consequences, including a thorough review and update of how US security assistance to Israel is provided and used. And so let me be clear here that J Street did strongly support the Van Hollen Amendment. We do believe that there should be restrictions on the way that US aid to Israel, which again, we fully support, there should be restrictions on the way that that aid is used. It should not be used to facilitate annexation and to hurt Israel's and the United States' security interests. We believe that Congress and the next administration must take steps to ensure that US security aid is not used to implement annexation or, for that matter, the expansion of settlements, the demolition of Palestinian homes, or other moves that entrench occupation. So as we've noted here today already, restricting US aid to use specifically for only certain purposes is responsible practice and is standard practice in US aid to other countries. Supporting use restrictions is different than advocating for security assistance to be cut, i.e. to be ended or reduced outright, or for that matter, conditioned. Conditioning, as the term is generally used, although in public discourse, it can be used a little bit more loosely, but as it is more strictly used, condition means withheld until certain conditions are met. That's not what J Street advocates. But US security aid to other recipient countries is subject to much more stringent accounting and approval measures. And in the interest of transparency and accountability, J Street believes that it is appropriate to stop applying a double standard and ensure that Congress and the American taxpayer have due visibility into how US aid is used by Israel as well. Now, while we won't necessarily support all policy or legislative proposals, our speakers today have identified a number of proposals besides the Van Hollen Amendment that have been floated. Nonetheless, J Street believes that this is a conversation that is overdue. We have helped to encourage this conversation, and we are encouraged by the vibrant discussion that is emerging on the most effective use of US security assistance. We believe it's important to engage in these debates and not shut them down, as many others are interested in doing. And as the Israeli government pursues increasingly destructive actions with the support of this Trump administration, it is vital to consider how the US-Israel relationship should evolve to actually promote the genuine shared interests of both countries and to avoid enabling the harmful agenda of the Israeli settlement movement and its allies. We will continue to support nuanced, effective, and progressive positions, which we believe can be implemented, especially after the next election, hopefully with a new Congress, perhaps a democratically controlled Senate, and hopefully a democratically controlled White House. And we will continue to support measures which can achieve broad popular support from the American Jewish community and the American people. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer your question, Gerald. I see we have a ton of questions in the Q&A, which I knew that we would have, and our time is limited. So I'm going to do the best that I possibly can here to address as many of these questions as we can. I'm going to turn to John Citron first and pose a question to Rob Malley. The question is from John: what might happen with a Biden administration with or without a Democratic Senate? So Rob, if you could look forward and think about what a Biden administration might do, and also, if you'd like, feel free to return to the article you mentioned, that April 23rd article in Foreign Policy, which you wrote with Phil Gordon, where you gave your prescriptions for a Biden administration. So what do you think a Biden administration should do, and what do you think they actually will do?
So, we could all try to speculate. I mean, we know what he said already, what his team has said already, which is that they would undo some of the steps that the administration has taken to the extent they can, consistent with the law. And so whether it's reopening the PLO office, resuming forms of assistance, some of those are constrained by legislation, which I think Andrew would be a better place than I to get into. Other things they said they would not do, move the embassy back to Tel Aviv, and that they said they would oppose annexation, but without specifying what they would do in the event annexation were to take place. I think a Biden administration would at least try to come back to, at a minimum, to the status quo ante. And I know for a lot of people that's, and I've been critical of our own, I'll speak for Andrew and myself, for our own tenure at the White House. We didn't achieve what we were hoping to achieve. In fact, it's not as if Israelis and Palestinians were closer to a two-state solution when we left office. But at least the status quo ante is try to undo as much of the damage that the Trump administration has done as possible. What Phil and I were hoping that Vice President Biden could do as early as now is to make clear that the U.S. would unrecognize, if Israel were to proceed with annexation, would unrecognize the annexation. What impact that would have, but at least to make clear and to say now that whatever you gain from the Trump administration, you would lose. That Israel would not be assured of U.S.'s support in international institutions if there was debate about an annexation, there was condemnation of Israel. The U.S. would not be in a position to defend Israel in those instances, depending, of course, on what the resolution were. And then, as I said, we had suggested as at least something to consider, some form of withholding of assistance, but that was one that we said should at least be part of the debate, whether it is something that the administration chooses to do or not. So I don't, now I'm going to really put speculative hat on my speculative hat. I don't think Israeli-Palestinian questions is going to be a priority for the next administration. I think they have domestic issues are going to take precedence over foreign policy issues, and China and other foreign policy issues are going to take precedence over Middle East, and Middle East issues other than Israel-Palestine are going to take precedence over Israel-Palestine. So I don't think we're going to see a big push. I don't think you're going to see the kind of effort that Secretary Kerry, for better or for worse, put in when in the second, like George Mitchell in the first, or Secretary Kerry in the second Obama administration. I don't think this will be a priority. I think in some ways you may see the administration taking a more hands-off attitude. What I would hope is that they would at least be as clear as they can about the policy that Israel is pursuing that are contrary to U.S. interests.
Thank you for that, Rob. We have a number of questions that have been submitted by folks who are interested in transparency and what could be done to make US aid to Israel more transparent. And I think, Andrew, this falls into your territory. So let me, if I may, let me just pose a few specific questions to you here. We've got a couple that come from Jason Berkovich, who asks, are other countries required to maintain a separate account for aid? And what is the easiest way to facilitate future audits? And just to throw in some additional questions there, what accounting and transparency methods have existed under previous administrations? Who compiles that information? Who has access to that information? And is Congress able to see any information that is collected by the administration? Can the general public see it? And generally, Andrew, is there a way to improve the transparency of US aid to Israel?
Thanks, Deborah. Regarding whether other countries are forced to establish separate accounts, the answer is yes, but it's even simpler than that. When the US provides foreign aid or military aid to any country, it actually never leaves the United States. It's sent to a bank account in the Federal Reserve that is controlled by the United States, but is intended for the recipient country. So when we give $1.3 billion per year to Egypt, that money actually never goes into Egyptian coffers. It never enters the Egyptian treasury. Israel, because of OSP, is unique in that regard. The non-OSP funding does go into a Federal Reserve account, and that money never goes into the Israeli bank accounts. But the OSP money, which again is entirely unique, that's the money that actually goes in to the Israeli economy, into Israeli bank accounts directly. So OSP, by its very nature, it obscures the accountability, the transparency that you would like under those circumstances. And it's very easy for the United States to figure out what's happening because we have to sign off on the checks when money is drawn for the Federal Reserve. We control it, not the recipient country. So we know with complete certainty what Egypt or Jordan or Iraq or Ukraine, any other recipient of FMF is using that money for, because we are greenlighting those contracts. And we do know, with respect to Israel, when they purchase items from the United States from their foreign reserve account. But we have no visibility into what Israel is doing with this money that is given as a check to them and goes directly into the Ministry of Defense accounts. When we were negotiating the MOU, we actually found a report from the early 1990s, and this relates to auditing, that the General Accounting Office did. And at the time, they determined that the OSP funding was nothing more than a subsidy for the Ministry of Defense. They couldn't find a way to tie that money to anything specific. It was just money that was offsetting costs that Israel would otherwise bear. And this obviously has larger implications, including for annexation. Because money is fungible, every dollar that Israel gets from the United States is one less dollar they have to use from their own accounts in order to support their national defense. And that's one more dollar available that they can use for whatever they want, including annexation, including settlement building. So while that's not the intent of US assistance, it's never been, it has the net effect of creating an environment in which it's relatively easier financially for Israel to pursue policies that are contrary to US interests, and which I think many Americans would argue are contrary to Israeli interests themselves. So that, in a nutshell, is part of that fundamental problem. And there were a few occasions during the MOU negotiations when the Israelis were asking for more money, and we reminded them, if you really need this money that badly, you could cut down on settlement building. That did not elicit a very positive or productive reaction from the Israelis, but it needed to be said at points in time because there is an obvious trade-off amongst them, and we need to recognize that some of these details are just details, they're just minutia, but it fits into the broader strategic perspective, the strategic analysis that Rob offered. And you can help to understand why, in certain respects, we're actually unintentionally making it easier for Israel to do some of the things that we don't want them to do. Now, in terms of how we could ensure audits are taking place, the best way to do that is to include it in legislation. And normally the General Accounting Office, which I mentioned, GAO, would be the ones who perform those types of audits. That's their job, to review how the US government is spending taxpayer money, whether it's foreign aid, whether it's domestic, whether it's national defense, whether it's domestic spending. They're the ones who are responsible for doing that. The major problem with accountability is that the executive branch ultimately decides when and where it's going to impose costs or penalties for violating any given law or any given, or any given policy. And I think, Rob and I have both observed this, and it's by no means specific to Israel. This is a general phenomenon that if you give the executive branch some flexibility, they're going to use it. And it can be very difficult, particularly in the Middle East, to ensure that we follow through on threats. I can think of instances where Egypt or the UAE or some country technically did something with US provided equipment that was illegal or that violated the contractual terms. And we would have been fully within our right to impose a consequence, but ultimately we chose not to do so because the discretion resided with the executive branch. So that political will question is the key to accountability. Unless Congress creates legislation, which it often is unwilling to do, that says you have to do this if the violation occurs, the executive branch is probably going to wriggle out of doing it. I mean, that may not be the case in a future administration, but that has been the case under both Republicans and Democrats previously. Even, if you're familiar with CATSA sanctions, the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which mandates, it compels consequences for countries that buy military equipment from the Russians or the Chinese. Egypt has done that. Turkey has done that. Neither country has paid the price, even though it's legally required. So there's more than a healthy amount of latitude in how these laws are provided, and it becomes very difficult. So just given the way the US government works, whether you like it or not, there needs to be political will. And that's where Congress comes in, because Congress ultimately needs to compel any given administration to follow through with the laws that it passes or its own policy statements. And certainly on issues related to Israel, there's been a general unwillingness to do so. Now, that's beginning to change, though slowly. I mean, I think it's significant that if you look at this outgoing Congress, two of the most important Democratic chairs, Nita Lowey of the Appropriations Committee, and now Elliot Engel of the Foreign Affairs Committee are, one is retiring, one has been defeated. You have other people coming in. And I think, as J Street has demonstrated, there are changes in American and American Jewish public attitudes towards Israel, towards how the US should deal with Israel. But to a great extent, Congress has lagged those trends. Maybe now it's starting to catch up. And I think the mere fact that something like the Van Hollen Amendment came forward and that it came from Chris Van Hollen, who's not a radical by any stretch of the imagination, is revealing of this challenge. And it speaks to the inflection point that Rob said we're at. Absolutely, but also for political reasons. But there's still this lag. So it's not automatic, and we may not see the party, we may not see members catch up with the broader public views for some years. And until that happens, I think no matter how much effort we put into designing accountability measures, mandating transparency, ultimately we're going to get less out of it than we would have hoped.
So on that note, Andrew, obviously you're right to note that Congress has been lagging behind where the US public is, where the American Jewish community is, and that is in fact exactly where J Street comes in. And so here we are at the end of this hour, and obviously we could continue this conversation, which I feel like we are just getting started, and we have so many questions in the Q&A for which I have to apologize to our audience that we're not gonna have a chance to get to today. But I wanna thank our two guests, Andrew Miller and Rob Malley, for joining us. for this really important and illuminating discussion. And again, I feel like we're just getting started, so maybe we'll have to have the two of you back in order to continue this conversation. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from home. We wish you all the best as we continue with our COVIDian reality. Hope everyone is doing well, or at least holding up okay, and look forward to seeing you here next time. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.